Hi, everybody. So, I want to talk about how civilization is the problem. Now, most people think about civilization and they think that it is the solution to everything. They celebrate civilization as humanity's greatest achievement, convinced that spreading democracy and progress lifts people from darkness into light. But here is what they refuse to acknowledge: most people do not want to become civilized, they don't actually choose to be civilized. Civilization is always imposed on people by violence. Human beings don't want to be civilized, animals don't want to be civilized. What people want, what all living things want, is freedom. They don't want every major decision about their lives decided by the majority. They don't want to be enslaved to majority will, to be reduced to one voice among millions, powerless and ignored. They don't want to be harassed by the police constantly. They don't want to have to beg the majority for permission to earn a livelihood, to get married, to control their own bodies, to have the right to die with dignity. Yet, this is exactly what civilization demands: total submission to the collective, mediated through state violence. Now, let's look at history honestly. The Native Americans were content as they were. They had to be forced to be civilized through genocide, through the destruction of their way of life, through generations of cultural annihilations. Africans were living according to their own systems and values. They had to be forced to be civilized through slavery, through colonization, through the barrel of a gun. No one wants to be civilized. Civilized is not accepted, it is imposed. Of course, once you have been raised in a civilized society, it becomes difficult to imagine anything else. This is because civilization has deprived you of your basic survival instinct and skills. We have all become domesticated animals, as dependent on our masters, just as any domesticated animal would be dependent on their masters. We don't even know how to survive without society's infrastructure, without its grocery stores, without its utility grids and its complex web of dependencies. But that does not mean that civilization is better. It only means that civilization has crippled us and made us completely dependent and deprived us of our self sufficiency. Think about what life would be without civilization. People would be far happier if they were able to hunt and forage, to build their own shelter, be free to live their life without having to work constantly, controlled like slaves, subjected to a system which they never consented to. Now, many people will point to technology as civilization's greatest gift, as if technology makes people happy. It does not. You can look around and see this for yourself. Do you think that people are happy with all this technology, with their smartphones, with their laptops, with their Teslas? No, they are not. People are more miserable now than ever. People are sicker more than ever. People are physically, mentally, and spiritually bankrupt. Technology does not make people happy. It keeps them distracted, disconnected, and dependent. Of course, nobody wants to live in abject poverty, but here's what civilization obscures. As long as you have access to food, water, and shelter, you have all you need to be content. You can spend your days in meaningful activities, singing songs, having sex, enjoying the company of those who you freely associate with, living in harmony with nature. You don't need to be controlled like a slave to be happy. In fact, this very control is precisely what destroys happiness. A civilized man is not a man at all. Rather, he is not a man to the extent that he is content with being civilized. He is not a man to the extent that he accepts being controlled like a slave and does not have a desire to be free and does not have a desire for his children to be free. A true man would actually rebel against his enslavement and rather than accept it. right? A true man would fight for his liberty and for the liberty of his offspring. But the civilized man does not do this. He is a slave who is happy to be enslaved. He is a domesticated animal who has lost his animal instinct, his connection to his own nature. Everything about him is controlled: his work, his movement, his thoughts, his very identity. And he's content with this. This is what makes him not a man. Not the mere fact of his enslavement, but his his acceptance of it, his willingness to live in bondage, his complete lack of desire for freedom for himself or for his children who are born in the same bondage he has embraced. So I'm not sure why people keep glorifying and romanticizing civilization as if there's something noble about being civilized. There's nothing noble about being a slave. There's nothing admirable about trading your autonomy for the illusion of security, your freedom for the promise of convenience. Civilization is actually the worst part of life. It's what makes life so intolerable. As an anti-natalist, the main reason I hold this position is because of civilization, because you were born into a society which enslaves you from birth. If you were born into the state of nature, into a primitive culture, life would actually be tolerable. The suffering would be natural, not artificial. I would not necessarily be an anti-natalist in a world without civilization. But civilization is the problem. The problem is the state and the state's oppression. The problem is being born to a system you never consented to, ruled by rules you never agreed to, controlled by authorities you never chose. None of us consented to democracy. None of us consented to be controlled and enslaved by the state. Civilization is the problem. When the West goes around spreading civilization and democracy, they don't do it because they believe it is in the best interest of people being civilized. No, that's propaganda. The reality is far more cynical. They do it because they want to exploit natural resources. They do it to impose centralized banking systems that allow them to extract wealth in exchange for worthless paper money. They do it to install puppet governments, modern day colonial administrators who serve foreign interests while oppressing their own people. It has nothing to do with freedom or liberty. These are just words they use to justify their conquest. The truth is that civilized people are the least free people on the planet. Here's how civilization works, and here's where its hypocrisy becomes most obvious. First, it observes your natural survival instincts and abilities. Then it makes you dependent. And then, when that dependency creates more problems, the solution is always more control, more civilization, more democracy, more dependency. Civilization forces you into a society where you are dependent on grocery stores. You have no ability to hunt and forage. Those skills have been bred out of you, educated out of you, regulated out of you. You are completely reliant on the state, capitalism, industrial agriculture, and supply chains. And then, after they have forced you to become dependent, after they have deprived you of your natural hunting and foraging skills, once you're locked into the system, once you have no choice but to depend on grocery stores, then here comes the control, here comes the manipulation and enslavement. Then they tell you that consuming your natural diet is unethical. They tell you that eating meat from animals is unethical because it comes from factory farms. The very factory farms which they relegated you to being dependent on in the first place. Now the solution is more control. Now the solution is for you to go vegan. But here's the question they don't want you to ask. How about not having civilized societies in the first place? Because without civilized societies, there would be no factory farms. There would be no industrial agriculture. Agriculture. There would be no need for grocery stores. There would be no ethical crisis. There would be no need for living as human beings have lived for thousands of years, hunting and foraging in balance with nature, taking what they need and not wasting anything. The solution to the problems created by civilization is not more civilization. It's not veganism. It's not stricter regulations and more control. The solution is to dismantle the systems that created these problems in the first place. Without civilized society, we would not have overpopulation. This is something that Thomas Malthus discussed in great detail about how we got to the population boom in the first place. Because without government intervention, people would naturally die through disease, famine, and basically nature would restore its own balance. But because of government intervention, now we have 8.5 billion people, 8.5 billion people who have to be fed. And because there's so many people, now all of a sudden we need more control in order to maintain order. We wouldn't need this order if there weren't so many people here in the first place. So the government creates the problem, and then they come with all the damn solutions. Without civilization, we would have sustainable population levels that would not be so destructive to the environment or to wildlife. The explosion of human population is not natural. It is not the result of biology or nature. It happened because of government intervention and civilization, systems that artificially sustain populations far beyond what the natural environment could support, including factory farming, by the way. Civilization provides industrial food production that allows people to survive who would not otherwise survive. It provides healthcare that extends life, but not the quality of their life. It forces people to live longer, more miserable existences. It creates incentives for larger families through welfare systems and economic structures that treat human beings as economic units, as workers and consumers. In a state of nature, population would naturally regulate itself through the carrying capacity of the land. There would be no overpopulation because the environment itself would impose limits. People would live in balance with their ecosystems, taking only what could sustain them naturally. But civilization overrides these natural limits. It extracts resources across the globe, concentrates them in developed cities, and sustains populations that have no relationship to the land on which they live. The result is ecological destruction on a scale that primitive societies could never achieve. Then civilization blames human nature for environmental destruction when that destruction is entirely based on civilization itself. Civilization is also responsible for the creation of discrimination that plague modern society, racism, homophobia, sexism. None of this exists in nature. None of this can exist without a state or a civilized society to codify it, to enforce it, and to perpetuate it. In a state of nature, in small tribes, people judge each other as individuals based on their character, their skill, their contributions to the group. There is no state to create and maintain racial hierarchies. There is no bureaucracy to legislate who people are allowed to love. There is no institutional framework to systematically oppress one sex in favor of another. Discrimination requires institutions. It requires laws that treat people differently based on arbitrary categories. It requires police to enforce those laws. It requires schools to indoctrinate children into accepting these hierarchies as natural. It requires media to reinforce stereotypes. It requires economic systems that benefit from keeping certain groups subordinated. In primitive societies, you might have individual prejudices, personal dislikes, but you cannot have systemic discrimination. You cannot have racism without a state to define racial categories, to enforce segregation, to maintain a racial caste system. You cannot have institutionalized homophobia without religious and legal institutions that criminalize certain expressions of love. You cannot have patriarchy in its civilized form without property laws, inheritance laws, marriage laws that codify male dominance. Civilization creates these categories of oppression and then pretends to be the solution to them. It passes civil rights legislation to address the discrimination it created in the first place. It celebrates progress when it slightly reduces the oppression that it created that would not exist without civilization. The state claims to protect minorities from discrimination while being the very institution that makes systemic discrimination possible in the first place. In a state of nature, you might face individual hostility, but you would never face the full weight of institutional oppression, police force, legal systems, economic structures, all aligned against you based on immutable characteristics. Civilization creates racism. Civilization creates homophobia. Civilization creates sexism. And then it has the audacity to claim that more civilization, more laws, more state intervention is the solution. Civilized people are far more degenerate than those living in a state of nature. They have no true concept of right and wrong beyond what is legal, what is socially acceptable. Their morality is entirely external, imposed by force, rather than understood through natural conscience. Civilized people are not happy. They are more miserable than anyone else. And you can see this misery in how they treat other people. Everyone wants to punch down. They take pleasure in other people's suffering. They take pleasure in controlling, abusing, and oppressing people, including their own children. Civilization is the worst form of society. What we need is not more civilization, but less. We should have a society based on free associations where people form their own tribes for their own security and mutual benefit, not massive states where you are forced to obey laws you did not consent to, enforced by police you did not choose in service of interests that are not your own. Jean-Jacques Rousseau has observed in a state of nature, people are happier, healthier, freer, and more noble. He wrote about the noble savage not as a romantic fantasy, but as an observation about human nature. The person living in a state of nature knows the difference between right and wrong because he learned it naturally through experience and conscience, not because society forced him to obey rules under threat of violence. Forcing people to obey rules and laws does not allow a person to develop moral understanding. What it does is create degeneracy. It creates people who only avoid wrongdoing because they fear violence, not because they understand what is actually wrong. It creates a society of moral children forever dependent on the state to tell them how to behave. In civilization, people are constantly comparing themselves to others to see who is more successful. They turn to greed, obsessing over money and status and material accumulation. Their lives become a competition they can never win, a race to the bottom with no finish line. In civilization, people are constantly focused on who they control, who they can oppress, who they can exploit. The entire system is based on hierarchy and domination. And in the state of society, you have no rights. The state is your master. The state has immunity to do whatever it wants. You are subjected to the state's laws, but these laws do not protect you in any way, shape, or form. These laws do not provide any protection against state oppression. The state protects its own and state actors. The state protects the wealthy and the powerful. This is because the state has a monopoly on physical force. Only the state is allowed to deploy violence. You are forbidden from protecting yourself, from defending your family, from taking justice into your own hand. All legitimate use of force has been claimed by the state. In a state of nature, you would take justice into your own hands. You would resort to self help. If someone were to violate your rights, you would beat them over the head with a club and be done with it. But no, in a state of society, you are relegated to relying on the state to avenge you. The state of society demands that you surrender your rights for self defense, your right to self action, direct action, your right to protect yourself and those you love. In exchange, it offers you nothing but endless bureaucracy and institutional indifference. The result is that in civilized society, you are subjected to constant oppression, exploitation, and enslavement. Civilization claims to be more peaceful than a state of nature, but this is a lie. Civilization is perpetual violence. The only difference is that civilized men are cowards. They don't deploy violence themselves, they outsource this violence to the state. Then they claim that the state's violence is legitimate because supposedly you consented to this bullshit. The reality is that none of us ever consented to any of this. We were born into the system. We had no choice. And when we object, when we refuse to comply, the state's violence is deployed against us, and civilized people cheer because the violence is legal, because it is sanctioned, because it allows them to pretend that their hands are clean. I can think of no one who is more ignoble than a civilized man. A civilized a civilized man is a domesticated animal who has no genuine concept of right and wrong, no real understanding of fairness or justice or liberty. He mouths the words but does not grasp its meaning. He has no natural instincts, no survival skills, no authentic thoughts of his own. Everything has been programmed into him by education, by media, by social conditioning. The civilized man is an automaton. If you have ever seen a civilized man, you have seen them all. They think the same thoughts, repeat the same talking points, follow the same patterns. They pride themselves on their individualism while being absolutely identical to everyone around them. A civilized man is a prodigious slave, preposterous because he can't even realize that he's enslaved. He thinks that his enslavement, his chains are jewelry. He thinks his cage is civilization and freedom. And that perhaps is the greatest crime of civilization. Not that it enslaves, but it teaches people to love their enslavement, to defend it, to spread it to others, and the genuine belief that they are actually liberating them. And here is the most damning truth of all: there is no longer any place where we can be free. It's not as if we can simply leave the state of society and go join some primitive cultures. We don't speak their language. We have no survival skills. Civilization has made sure of that. It has crippled us so thoroughly that we cannot imagine living without this civilization. But even if we somehow acquire these basic survival skills, even if we somehow learned how to survive in the wild, where would we go? Civilization is constantly encroaching on primitive people. There are few remaining uncontacted tribes. Their lands are shrinking year by year, their way of life under constant threat from lodgers, miners, missionaries, and governments determined to integrate them into the modern world, to civilize them. There is no place on the planet that doesn't have a centralized banking system. There is no place on the planet that isn't controlled by a state. Every square inch has been claimed, mapped, divided, and subjected to some government's authority. The entire world has been civilized. The global system is totalizing. You cannot opt out. You cannot escape. Even the remote corners of the earth are within the reach of satellite surveillance, international law, economic systems that reduce everything to commodities, and monetary value. We are born into a prison that spans the entire planet, and unlike prisoners who can at least dream of freedom beyond the walls, we cannot even conceive of what exists outside of civilization because there is nothing outside of civilization anymore. It has conquered everything. Is the final cruelty. Not just that we are enslaved, but we are enslaved in a world where freedom itself has been eradicated. We are domesticated animals in a world with no wilderness left. Subjects of a state in a world where statelessness is impossible. Workers in an economy that has commodified every last resource on earth. Civilization has won, and winning, it has made life intolerable for everyone trapped in it, which is to say, everyone. Civilization is the problem. Until we recognize this, we will continue to mistake our enslavement for progress, our cages for society, our enslavement for freedom. But recognizing our enslavement alone is not enough. Because even if we awaken to our enslavement, there is nowhere left to turn, no refuge from the system that has consumed the world. We are born in enslavement and we will die as slaves. And civilization calls this progress.